So at idle, the GT sounds pretty good. There is a little bit of rattling in there. You can hear it knocking around just a little bit. It does drive really nice, but you can definitely hear knocking from the engine. And so it's unfortunate that this engine's going to have to come out and get replaced. So I contacted the guy who sold me the engine. He's actually a friend of mine. He lives down there in Vegas, has a Terminator Cobra and some other cool cars. And I told him what was going on. Now when he got this engine, he had bought the whole car. All he did was put it on a trailer, take it home, and strip the car. And so it was a title issue car, and he just wanted to sell the drivetrain out of it. So he knew that it ran, and at idle it does sound okay, but when the car warms up especially, you can hear it knocking. And so I just left it up to him. I told him that the engine had a knock. I put a brand new oil filter and fresh oil in it. I primed it before I started it, and the car started up fine, but it did have that knock to it, especially with some RPM. So I left it up to him to see what he was going to say about it. He said, well, I want to make it right, so let's work something out. And so he refunded me a good amount of my money, and it puts me in a position now where I can buy another engine, and I do have another engine lined up. Although I am out still some of my money from that engine and all my labor and the fluids and filter and all that stuff, but that's just what happens with used engines. You're kind of taking a gamble and a risk. But this other engine I have lined up is a really nice one, so we'll get to that later. But here are some videos of the engine. You can hear the knock when you rev it up. And I did take the car for a little drive, and going uphill you can hear a lot of knocking when it's under load. It really sounds like a diesel truck more than a Mustang at this point. But anyway, I took the exhaust off because I wanted to make sure that it didn't have a clogged up catalytic converter. I know sometimes that can make a tapping noise and you wouldn't know what it is, and it could sound like it was engine noise. So I wanted to make sure that it wasn't anything on my side before I got this money back for the engine. So I took the whole exhaust system off, and I was actually surprised to find all this junk in the catalytic converter. This is between the exhaust manifold and the cat, so this would have been pre-cat. So I don't know what this stuff is, but obviously it wouldn't go through the catalytic converters. It might be catalytic converter material that got loosened out when I was beating the exhaust system off because it was on there pretty tight. But I got the exhaust off, and I did run the car open headers, and I revved it up, and you can hear it knocking like crazy. So I know whatever is wrong with the car is definitely a spun bearing or piston slap or something wrong with that new engine. So that's really unfortunate. But anyway, I had some more issues to work on the car anyway. I have another engine lined up, and I'll talk about that later. But the window didn't roll down on the car, so I thought I could still work on the car and do a lot of things to it. Now it's going to need some things cleaned up, but I was having a problem with these switches, and on the driver's side these switches would not roll down the window on the driver's side or the passenger side, and it turned out to be this wire here was crimped from the previous owner, and it had come undone. And so when I put the wire back in, now I could use the buttons on the driver's side to make the window go down, but the driver's side window would not go down. And I had taken a lot of time with a test light looking for power to the switch, and the door lock button on this side worked and everything, but just not the power for the window, so it was really hard to figure it out. I traced the wires all underneath the carpet. I had done a whole lot of stuff and pulled the wires out from under the dash, and anyway, I finally figured it out. It took forever, and this little connector was actually wrapped tightly in black electrical tape, so it was kind of hidden. And so it seemed like the window was still jammed on the driver's side, but I could hear power trying to get to it and it binding up. So I took the window motor out, and I went over to Danny Johnson's house, and he had this extra passenger side door from a New Edge Mustang, and the window motor was still in there, and he was nice enough to let me take it out, and he showed me how you can switch the bases of those motors and make them work for either side. So he had a cool video about that on YouTube that I watched before I went over there. So I came home with the extra window motor and I disassembled each one and I put them back together and plugged them in, and they worked really nicely. And so now the windows roll down, and that was good because I spent a couple of days with no success on that and it made me frustrated. So the next thing to do was get the radio to work, because the radio had no power to it, and that was frustrating as well. And it was working before I pulled the engine out of the car and before I was working on the window, so I assumed that a wire had come loose on the back of the stereo, and that's exactly what happened. And I was actually testing it, and I had the key back looking for power, and that power wire was live, and it was back there, and it touched part of the framework on the inside of the dash and sparked a little bit. And I know I should have the battery unplugged while I'm working on the car, but I needed it plugged in so I can see if I had power to the radio or not and where the power was coming from. So I pulled the bundle of wires away from the framework of the dash so it wouldn't spark, and I jumped out and unplugged the battery, and then I crimped that wire back in where it should go with a new connection, and now I had power to the stereo again. So I was really happy to get that all done, and here I had to keep pulling out more of the dash so that I could put in some new things. I wanted to install this bracket that goes really nicely by the air conditioning. It uses 2 bolts from one side of the air conditioning controls to bolt in place and slips out the side of the bezel there. And it's a nice little faceplate there to have so I can attach a little holder for my phone, so I can use an app on my phone that has a speedometer. Because if you remember, the transmission on this car is a built automatic, but it's out of a 99 Plus. So there's no way for the speedometer to work with the older style cable-driven speedometer instead of the newer electronic style. And so having my phone there with an app on it with a speedometer solves that problem. So that's something I wanted to do, and I had saved this bracket. It actually came out of my Blue Mach 1. It used to hold the Sirius satellite radio on it, but I deleted all that when I bought the car in 2010. So that bracket's really cool, and I'm glad to install that. So now it was really nice to put the door panels back on the car and put these other panels underneath the steering wheel back on. This had always been off the car since I bought it. It was sitting in the trunk, so I got some hardware for it and put it back on. And on the passenger side, I got some zip ties and bundled all this back up together and put it back up under the dash where it's nice and clean. So that looks all cleaned up, and then I put all the shifter and everything back together and the radio bezel, and so now the interior looks really nice. I vacuumed it out and cleaned it up a little bit. Definitely have some more work to do, but anyway, until I get the new engine installed, the car is somewhat drivable. I'm not going to take it very far. I'll be able to drive it up to where I'm going to be changing the engine on it, and so I'll talk about that later as I get those details worked out. But there's still some things to do on the car, like clean up the paint and try to get the power steering to work and power brakes, because there still is issues there. But the car is coming together pretty nicely, and I'm happy to keep working on it, and I'm excited to make this car a lot nicer than it was. So stay tuned for more of the build of this car, along with my other Mustang videos and stories. And subscribe to the channel if you're not on here already, and stay tuned for more of this content.